The next question. It's good to be flexible. Mr. LaRouche, one of the issues that we are looking at is that no matter how you do your calculations, the problem is that the total amount of current outstanding debt is greater than any real existing economic value. And this is the case both for banks, but also in some cases for nations. There is not any obvious way to resolve this unless we step outside of the current framework. In your view, is there a way that this can be addressed, at least initially, by treaty agreements between individual nations on the road toward a much larger restructuring of the global system?
You know, treaties come after the war has been won, not before. And that's the way you have to look at this. Now, we in the United States are not really alone. We have some very important potential allies who are not consolidated now because we had an administration that does not lend itself to collecting allies before. For example, Russia. Russia, China, and China in particular, are nations which are large nations in different respects. China, 1.4 billion people. Russia is not as much people, is not that large, much larger as a population, though significant, but the territory and the characteristics of the territory in terms of mineral resources are really truly important. India will join in an effort which is shared by Russia and China. And such an agreement among those nations with the United States would mean the automatic joining of Japan, of Malaysia, of Korea, and so forth. So we have in our hand a potential alliance with a very large part of the state-by-state population and the growing sympathy for such an enterprise among the people of Europe, among the nations of Africa, and among the forces in South and Central America. So we potentially have an alliance for peace which is comparable to the U.S. alliance for war during World War II. We don't need to go further than that. We simply have to decide how we're going to proceed in our discussions with Russia and Russian channels and China channels, India channels, which I'm involved in, for example, and certain forces in Europe which are flip-flop, but nonetheless are accessible. As you see, the rally for defense of Sudan among African and Arab nations, that's not an isolated situation. That can be our ally, among others. So what we have to do is we have to decide on what a U.S. policy is, knowing in advance that it's the only policy that any decent person would want to support, and knowing that we can win that support. It means you have to talk to Russia in terms that actually convince relevant people in Russia to understand that we're dead serious about this. And the first thing you have to understand in this kind of thing, don't propose to somebody that they join you in a war when you're not sure whether you want to fight that war or not. So therefore, you have to determine what is the vital interest of the United States. And you have to proceed, as I do, to go back to the origins of the United States in those elements of the European colonization, such as the Mayflower Compact and the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony prior to 1588, 1589. And you have to do exactly that and say, this is us. What are we? We're not people who ran away from Europe. We're people who came here in order to save Europe from itself, to create a force in the United States or in America which would take the best of European civilization, save it, nurture it, but get rid of the other stuff, which the Europeans by themselves could not do. We have to know that that's who we are. That's the meaning of our existence as a nation on this planet. Otherwise, why should we exist? What's our purpose in existing? Our purpose in existing is to take the best of European civilization, nurture it here, and do the same thing with respect to other countries and their cultures. And be the nation, the only true republic really on this nation, on this planet by our Constitution. And use that authority and act with firmness and resolution, because if you're not willing to actually fight the war yourself and take the responsibility for the war, nobody's going to come to the party. So don't hesitate and say, what's going to work? What's going to work? You have to take what should work and what it is necessary to accomplish and stick to that. I can tell you, if I were president of the United States, I could win this war. My job is to convince President Obama to do as I would do. I would win this war.
Mr. LaRouche, the sums of money currently involved in the bailout policy not only are obviously not helping, but seem to be feeding what we think is the most critical problem that we face, and that has to be resolved. An overall survey of the state of the U.S. economy, and most specifically of U.S. infrastructure, indicates that at least over the last 25 years, which is the period that we were investigating, the United States has suffered a net loss of both basic economic infrastructure and also of productive capacity. Any measurable growth that we could find has been largely in what would at best be considered soft infrastructure, but to be honest, is largely located in the sheer growth of speculative values. Under these conditions, to get to the point, it would seem that one of the things that has to be addressed is not simply that the bailout cannot work, but that in fact the bailout serves, at least in technical terms, and especially from the standpoint of your triple curve function, that the bailout itself serves to drive the nation deeper into bankruptcy and is making the task of building our way out of it all the more difficult. Do you agree with this? And do you have anything more you'd like to say about it?
Well, first of all, we have to understand that the British are conducting, or British interests are conducting a war against the United States. And you look at what's happening. The British are determining our policy through this Wall Street crowd. You see it again. What they're doing, they're inflating, they're causing us to engage in hyperinflation. We have reached the point now that we're already ready to go into a hyperinflationary explosion of the type experienced by Germany in the summer of 1923. And the British are doing it directly to us as an act of warfare against us. We have to crush them. And the way to crush them is to do it, take the obvious thing. Sink their boat. And you sink their boat by using the weapon of bankruptcy. Under U.S. law, under U.S. Constitution, and use the principle of the general principle of the welfare, the preamble of the Constitution, which is the fundamental law of the Constitution. It's not a preamble, it's not something like that sort. It is a statement of the purpose of the existence of the United States. The other aspects of the Constitution pertain to the implementation of that. But that's the fundamental principle. And therefore you use that principle and you enforce it. And the world is looking for leadership. The Chinese are looking for leadership now. The Indians less so, but they also would like a little bit. Russia is looking for a leadership role by the United States. Africa is looking for a leadership role from the United States. They want to get rid of the British. The drug problem frightens people. You have whole governments that are terrified of George Soros's drug armies. We have the weapons and we have the cause. And we have the Constitution. We can win this. We have to have a government that has the guts to win. But you have politicians who want a no-risk war.